So I spent a lot of time there. So it's nice to be able to do these programs for where you kind of grew up. I live today up in Butler, real close to Marine State Park. Part of it was done on purpose so I could bird and do some other stuff there. But so I developed my birding skills really in the Franklin Park, Wexford area. And I am going to talk about common birds that you'll find here in Western Pennsylvania, particularly our area. Um, but there's some really cool things, in particularly birds that are coming through now. And there's what we refer to them in the birding world as eruptives. So an eruption, you think of a volcano, right? An eruption, it's something that doesn't happen all the time, and there's specific causes for this. So some birds, like robins, for example, regularly migrate from year to year basis, but some birds will, in large numbers, erupt out of the northern forests in Canada and Alaska into the lower 48 when you have certain conditions, and usually it's a lack of food. So this year we've been finding evening grosbeaks, which is great because I've not seen one in Western PA since I was probably in middle school back in the late 80s. Also another bird called a pine siskin, another which are just starting to show up called common redpolls. And the last one, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they come in larger numbers, is called a white-winged crossbill. And as the name suggests, their bills are crossed. They're kind of like the pine forest versions of parrots because they hang upside down on pine cones and use their cross bills to open up the seed scales and put their tongue in there and pull them out. So those aren't common birds, but they're pretty neat ones that are coming through, and we're all excited in the bird world because we don't normally get to see these species. Some years you get snowy owls. So if you're familiar with Harry Potter, the white snowy owls come in large numbers infrequently, but it does happen usually every 3 to 5 years. So we're pretty excited for that. So what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to pull up here my presentation. See if I can find it. Here we go. We'll start from the beginning. And so we'll go through some of these, and I'm not going to talk just about the birds themselves. Let's go up here. I'm going to talk about, again, some of these common winter birds, some of their strategies, ecology, and life history, some ways you can actually attract them, and then we'll get into some of the specific species here. And there's a lot of really interesting things. A lot of people, and maybe a number of you, feed birds at your houses or apartments, wherever you live. And you want to track them. There are a lot of myths associated with bird feeding that I'm going to talk about briefly as well, and some things that you can really do to really increase the number of birds, not just in winter, but year round, and help them in your properties. You may or may not have seen this, but within the last year, they've done some pretty substantial population studies on birds in North America. And since 1970, we've lost probably about 3 billion birds in North America. So their population, if you aggregated all of the birds in North America in 1970, they were roughly around 10 billion individual birds, right? Today, in the year 2020, we're down to a little less than 7 billion birds. So there's a lot of reasons why even common birds like cardinals and blue jays and robins are declining. So there's things that you could do to help. So winter, when a lot of people think of common winter birds, and especially feeding them in the winter time, this is really the time of year where you start to see a lot of people ramp up buying bird feeders. This is a suet cage here. It's rendered fat. Doesn't have to be necessarily from animals. It could be vegetable fat, sunflower, whatnot. But there's a lot of these conceptions that we have to feed birds this time of year to help them survive. And so I have this on here. There's what I call my winter bird myths, right? And one of the biggest one is birds will starve to death if we don't feed them. And I know I shouldn't say this because I work for the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. I'm the director of education there. Part of my salary is paid by us selling bird seed, right? Maybe you've heard of Beechwood Blend. But so this maybe is not a good thing, and I say that in jest, but birds will not starve to death if we don't feed them. In fact, a lot of the studies show that at most in any given year, and there's some variation, birds are only getting maybe about 15% of their total calories from our feeders. When we get deep snow or we get ice, you'll see them there more often. But if you watch them close enough, these birds are usually just taking seeds and flying off with them and caching them for a future rainy day, as we say. So the other myth is that birds then, if since we're feeding them and we have to keep feeding them because they become over dependent on humans, and then we'll of course go hungry if we stop. Also, again, false, because if they're only getting a small percentage of their calories from feeders, they're not going to become over dependent. I hear this one a lot, and I always joke if I got $1 every time I had someone call me at Audubon and ask me this, I probably could have retired a few years ago. But it's one of them that I feel like I have to feed birds, but I want to take down my feeders in August or September because if I don't, birds won't migrate. They'll stick around and try to eat, and then they'll starve to death in the winter. That is absolutely false because most of the birds, 90%, and we're going to talk about these particular species, are birds that are here year round in Western Pennsylvania, anyways, like our cardinals and chickadees and titmice, nuthatches. It doesn't matter. They're not going to migrate regardless. A number of the birds that do migrate aren't coming to feeders anyways because they're primarily insect eaters. And so when it gets cold, the insects decrease. So it doesn't matter. They're going to move south where the insects are. So you're not going to have them starve to death. Lastly, feeding birds will make me go broke. Well, that is somewhat subjective, right? So this is completely up to you, but you can actually feed birds, attract some of these common winter birds to your yard, wherever you live, relatively easy, and do it in a relatively inexpensive way. Now, some people go all out because if you feed birds, you'll know that you will attract other things than just birds, right? Deer, raccoons. Up my way where I live in Butler, we can have bears come to ours. So that's up to you, but there are ways to, of course, get around those types of things, and some of them can be more expensive, others less so. But don't think that you're going to go broke just by feeding birds, okay? And that is really the best way, especially when you're starting, is to get some of these common winter birds, to be able to identify them because they're right there in your backyard, and enjoy them and start to learn some of their life history and ecology as well, okay? So what are some of the things that birds have to deal with in the winter versus the summer and spring months where it's a little bit more temperate, right? Well, first off, we know, and we call it winter thermoregulation, which is just a fancy way of saying, how do birds deal with colder temperatures? Now, again, I see this. I've been leading bird walks for well over 8 years now and been birding for 20 some plus years. I've heard it constantly. People are like, oh, we'll have a day where the temperature is at or below zero. And usually it's during my Christmas bird counts, and people will go, oh, I feel so bad for these birds. They must be freezing. And actually I go, no, the birds are fine. I feel bad for the people that are going out here spending all this time outside, because birds are incredibly efficient at regulating their temperatures, right? And we'll talk about these specifics in a little bit here. But in the winter, right, they've got cold temperatures they got to deal with. There's less day length in which to forage, right? So as we know now, the days are getting shorter, so there's less time, especially with our diurnal or daytime birds that are up during the day. And then they have to fast through long nights, right? So you get into around Christmas time and the winter solstice, right? They've got some long nights in which to get through, and more so the further north you go. And lastly, and this is important, the relative scarcity of food, okay? And this is depending on what they eat, because believe it or not all food sources are scarce during the winter time, right? In fact, I'd argue that there's more abundance of certain types of foods than you're going to find in other types of years, right? And so when we look at this, we're going to see, how do birds respond to these conditions? Well, there you go. This is a black-capped chickadee, and some of you may have seen these ones. Interestingly enough, I grew up in, like I said, Franklin Park, Wexford. This was the common chickadee that we had in that area. Today, as we speak, blackcaps are no longer there with you if you live in the North Hills or Franklin Park or Wexford, in that area, or any point south. They have always coexisted in what we call a hybridization zone. So where they butt up to their southern cousins, the Carolina chickadees, they will interbreed. So it's called the hybrid zone. Carolina chickadees they're not as hardy as the blackcaps. And so there's a minimum winter temperature that they will perish once it gets below that, but these guys survive. And previous to our warming climate, blackcaps would be able to deal with our colder winters. As it is warmed here in the 20th and now in the 21st centuries, the Carolinas have actually moved their ranges north and have displaced these guys in our area. So like I said, if you live around Northland Library, even at Northland Library, you're going to find Carolina chickadees, not blackcaps. And Carolinas are definitely less apt at dealing with colder temperatures, where these blackcaps are. So there's different ways. And the big thing is, again, believe it or not, it's finding the food sources. So you may have seen this particular native plant. It's, I think, a really gorgeous one, and I grow it in my own yard here in Butler. This is a goldenrod. Okay, and we have a number of different types, but a very common Western Pennsylvania native plant, very good for pollinators and other native insects. But once it's done being pollinated, and we get into this time of year, it is a massive food source for birds. And so what you're seeing there is a bunch of seed heads that I'm seeing in the fields here and other places, Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve, where my office is, filled with these things. So really right now, from a standpoint of native food, there is a ton of food sources for them to eat coming from our native plants. Another great one is, you see these pink ones. This is a native plant that's known as Joe Pye weed. It's named after a Native American from up in Massachusetts. His name was anglicized to Joe Pye. And he used the plant actually to cure some English colonists or Puritans up there. He probably lived to regret that, actually, from if you know their history. But this plant is also another really important one that is beautiful, but also attracts lots of bees and butterflies. But once it turns, it produces a highly nutritious and very common and bountiful seed head that looks very similar to a type of seed that they sell in stores called Niger. If you feed birds and have Niger that you use for goldfinches and other species, this is our native natural version of that. And birds will seek this out 10 times out of 10 to anything you can ever offer in your feeders. I mean, they will eat this stuff instantaneously because this is what they evolved with. This has the high fats and proteins and nutrition. So they've got a lot of those foods that help fuel their fire to help them get through these colder nights. I'm a big apple guy, and that's another topic for another day, but every year we have either a really good fruit set or a minimum fruit set, because there's cycles of this, or somewhere in between. And this isn't just with crab apples and other fruits. There's lots of different things that fall within this particular fruiting family, right? So we've got, and you'll see some other pictures, there's wild plums and pears and cherries and things like that. These evolved, even crab apples, to essentially survive for a good portion of winter until they are ripe, usually in January and February and March, for then the birds to devour and, of course, excrete the seeds out. And they're like that, because if you've ever eaten a crab apple, right, it's extremely acidic. It's not very pleasant like our table apples, and it's done so because it allows the fruit to mature and have the seeds actually mature so they're ready to be planted in the spring. Here's another one. This is one of our native grapes. There's a couple different types, but they're generally described as what's called fox grapes. These are some of the ancestors to our Concord grapes, but they're called fox grapes because they've got a musky smell. And some of our early colonists tried to make wine out of it. And if you ever had Concord wine, imagine that times 10 with that sort of musky flavor. But for birds, this is a really important food source that lasts a good portion of winter as well. Here's another one. People often will confuse this particular vine with poison ivy. It's not. It's got 5 leaves. As you can see on there, it really turns a beautiful scarlet burgundy red in the fall. This is called Virginia creeper. It will not harm any of your trees, even your house. Some people have it grow on bricks, but it produces a fruit source that is one of the most highly sought after by birds. And it's high energy, high nutrition, and it really helps them. And I've seen woodpeckers and every other type of species eat these guys. Here's another native shrub here. This is called winterberry. another food source that a lot of these birds will use to help fuel themselves through the winter time. Here's an interesting one, and I don't recommend you guys grow this, but it is extremely common. My eyes are itching just looking at that. That is poison ivy berries that you see right there. Believe it or not, that's what a berry. That's the fruiting body of poison ivy. And poison ivy, believe it or not, is in the cashew family. So in the larger family with cashews, mangoes are also a part of this family as well. So some people that have severe poison ivy allergies can't even eat mangoes or cashews because there are some trace amounts of those oils, the uracils, that can cause them to break out. But for birds, right, this is a very extremely important food source. And one of the reasons why you find poison ivy everywhere is because birds eat the seeds constantly and spread them about. They are waxy, very dense, high in fats, really high in fats, right? If you've ever had a cashew, cashews are high in fats. This is, again, very similar. But birds also, this time of year, especially when I do bird surveys or bird walks, I look specifically for poison ivy. Not touching it, not playing with it, not doing any of that. But I know birds and different types of winter species are going to be hanging around there because they will seek this particular species to eat. So one of the strategies, right? So we talked about this. So birds that vacation south for the winter, right? And I want to change that paradigm. A lot of people that were taught, or at least if you know anything about birds, think, oh, our birds go south for the winter, just like we call here in snowbirds, right? They may live in Western PA, but go down to Florida and spend all winter and then come back in the spring. That's not how these birds that are migrating to either, southern US or the Caribbean or Central America, or even all the way down, some of them migrate down to southern South America. Don't think of it like our birds going south and then returning home in the spring. It's the exact opposite. These are tropical species that evolved to migrate north when, during the glaciers, our woodlands that we have around here were much closer to Mexico and southern Florida. So these tropical species adapted to that. And then as the glaciers receded and these forests went there, they sort of increase their migration. So when you see an oriole or you see a scarlet tanager or all sorts of other beautiful birds like that, those are tropical birds that come north to breed and then go home in the wintertime. But this is a strategy because they are primarily insect eaters and there's not a lot of insects, right? So all birds, right? Even birds like penguins that use water to fly, and they do fly through the water, all birds have feathers. In fact, if there was one distinguishing characteristic that differentiates birds from all other species, it's feathers. And I'm not going to go off too far on a tangent, but feathers are really, they evolved on dinosaurs. And so birds in a lot of ways are really, if you look at their evolutionary lineage, they're the closest thing to a dinosaur that you're ever going to see. In fact, recently they found a lot of our common species, even Tyrannosaurus rex, had feathers of some type, which I think is pretty cool. But feathers are some of nature's best insulation that's ever been developed, okay? And here's why, right? So first off, plumage in a lot of our common winter birds becomes generally thicker in winter and also at higher latitudes, right? So birds that are up in the mountains. Now, you're not going to see this on the outside. This happens with their down feathers underneath their feathers that coat their contour feathers that coat their bodies, right? But they do wear and tear at their feathers, just like our hair will sometimes fall out and we'll replace it. So they will molt that. Some species like chickadees, there's not great seasonal differences, particularly with smaller birds like that. They will increase more down feathers. But there's not really going to be anything that you really notice. They're not going to get noticeably larger, okay? At least with their feathers. There is a differentiation to this we'll talk about. But this is what I think is fascinating. So think of a black-capped chickadee, right? I showed you early on there. If on one of our coldest winter days, the temperature differential between their skin, so right underneath that down layer, their skin, and the outside air, And really, even a fraction of a millimeter can be as much as 40 degrees Celsius, or really we're getting up there like almost 50 some degrees Fahrenheit difference between their skin and the outside air. Now think about that. That is incredibly huge different range in temperature, right? And that has everything to do with feathers and their ability to insulate. Now, I can't see hands, obviously, right? But think about this. If you've ever had a feather or down coat or down blanket, you can attest to this. And I remember when I was a kid, I had a down jacket, and it was by far the warmest jacket I've ever had. And it's just because feathers are really great at trapping heat. And we'll see some pictures of this in a minute. They also, in the winter times, fall and winter, especially now, develop more subcutaneous fat, right? And this time of year too, and we were sitting around a little bit more, we're not outside, maybe eating a little bit more. We develop some of this ourselves as humans, but their fat underneath their skin starts to layer a little bit more insulation. But this doesn't happen in all birds. You see this in penguins and ruffed grouse and a couple other birds that are in really cold areas, but not all birds do this. Most store them in only two different places. I'm not going to get too specific, to burn off that fat for energy to keep them warm rather than using as insulation, because the feathers are already good enough to do this. Most of them are going to be just burning through that, and usually at nighttime, right? Because these birds have very high metabolisms to keep themselves warm. And at nighttime, it's like they're stoking that coal furnace. They got to turn up the heat to keep them burning through the night, and they're burning that fat. Most small birds, ground foragers, store more of this, and as I mentioned, serve as fuel store and don't really contribute much to insulation there. So a guy like a cardinal, this is a male cardinal that you see here. If I showed you, this picture is from November. If I showed you the same picture from July, you would not notice any difference in that bird. You'd have to catch that bird and hold it in your hand and push through the breast feathers and see a little bit of that insulation, but notice where the fat will then be accumulating for that bird to use in the wintertime. So it's nothing that you see by your eye alone. And these guys, right, this time of year, most of these birds are not singing because there's not a breeding it's not breeding season, right? So the energy is now turned to finding food. And again, you see here both a male and female cardinal in the back. She's got her little crest up there and a mourning dove. So this is their main purpose right now in these non-breeding months, is to find food. I do want to point something out real quick, which is kind of secondary to this. But if you notice, right, I'm going to show you an example here. This is a male cardinal in November. I don't know if you guys got snow about a week or so ago, or a week and a half down your way, but we got about an inch up here. And I remember I woke up that morning, it was Monday, I don't know, it was like the first day or second day of November, and I looked at my apple tree and I had two male cardinals sitting out in the snow and just as bright as day, right? They don't lose their coloration, neither do blue jays. Now, a species we have here called the American goldfinch, the male is sometimes called a wild canary, but it's not. That's the perfect Pittsburgh bird, right? They're bright yellow with black and gold kind of colors on them. Those males lose that. And I always tell people, why do blue jays and male cardinals not lose their coloration, but the male goldfinches do? And it has everything to do with how birds see color versus how we see color. We don't see ultraviolet. They see on the ultraviolet spectrum. So in the ultraviolet spectrum, blue, like this blue jay here, appears to them, and more importantly, to the predators that eat them, other birds, as a shade of gray. Where the red on a male, whoops, going the wrong way, on a male cardinal appears black. Now to us, it looks red and blue, right, on the other bird, but not to birds of prey that eat them. However, the yellow on a male goldfinch, we and birds of prey can see yellow exactly the same. So on a snowy gray day, that yellow would stand out like a sore thumb. So that is how natural selection has worked on those guys. Moving along, I just always thought that was an interesting thing to share with people. But some of our common winter birds, this is called mast. So these are white oak acorns. And if you've noticed around your house, if you have any of these trees or any parks near where you live, this is an on year for mast. So they do this in various cycles. So we are having a lot of blue jays this year because those blue jays Some of them are here year round, but a lot of blue jays north of Lake Erie in Canada and Quebec migrate into our area. And so our Canadian blue jays are sticking around eating a lot of acorns because this is one of their favorite foods. So you may have heard in the past that, of course, squirrels, hide acorns and forget about them and turn to oak trees. Believe it or not, squirrels have pretty good memories. It's actually the blue jays that mostly plant a lot of the oak trees that you see growing rather than squirrels. In fact, I'd probably say around 95% of these oaks that are growing are most likely planted from blue jays, and they forgot about them. They're close cousins. They're in the same family as crows and ravens. This is an American crow. The overarching family is called Corvidae. So corvids, as we call, are blue jays, ravens, crows, and magpies. All incredibly intelligent, all very smart birds. All of them are scavengers. Notice right now, if you have a chance, in the evenings or in the mornings, but it's more noticeable in the evenings, like around 4:30, you'll start seeing a number of crows streaming down to the city of Pittsburgh. And that's because they live in a roost in the winter times here of somewhere between 40 and 50,000 crows. And that's one of their strategies. And we have one of the largest crow roosts. Now, good thing I don't live in Oakland or Lawrenceville or a place like that, because that's where they're all kind of hanging out, but the Homewood Cemetery. But they have learned over the years that cities are warmer and safer for them. So they're coming in pretty large numbers. And they're scavengers. So there's going to be a lot more food in those cities and surrounding areas as well. So some of these other birds, like you see example here, this is an American robin. Our robins migrate south, but we get Canadian robins that hang around here all winter. And most of the time they're eating fruit. This is a gorgeous bird that we were seeing a lot more recently because there's a lot more fruit. This is a cedar waxwing. And this color doesn't really do them justice. If you ever held one in your hand, it's amazing that coloration that they have, that cedar color. But they're called waxwings, as you can see on their wings there. There's little red that are on there, look like their secondary feathers were dipped in hot wax, and they got this really noticeable yellow on their bottom tail feathers. Really cool birds that are increasing in pretty large numbers because our fruit availability is increasing, which is a good sign. This is an actual warbler species that can hang around here all winter, and it too, like the robin and the cedar waxwing, eats fruit. Now, a lot of people, when they think of robins, right, and I'll go back, I go, what do robins eat? Those people go, oh, worms, right? Believe it or not, no. They're fruit eaters primarily. They switch to worms in breeding season, but they eat fruit as their main food source. And these guys, this warbler here, this is known as a yellow-rumped warbler. You can see that little patch of yellow there on its rump. In the bird world, us bird nerds affectionately call them butterbutts, right? So if you hang around experienced birders who go, oh, I just saw a butterbutt, that's this guy, the yellow-rumped warbler. You can see it looks like a little slab of butter just right above their butt. It's very conspicuous. Underneath their wings, you can't see there are yellow as well. Looks like armpit stains, but it's a good ID in finding these guys. But they too, we get them in small numbers every winter hanging around because they primarily eat fruit, and poison ivy is their favorite food source. So I've been monitoring a population in Moraine State Park for over 15 years where you get about 24 that there is so much poison ivy berries that they can survive throughout the winter. So again, it's mostly food. That is the big thing here with our common winter birds, and allowing them to hang around or stay. Here's another one. And we'll look at some more specifics, but this is another one that eats fruit all winter. So depending on if we have a really good fruit year or bad fruit year will depend on their numbers. But this is a relatively common woodpecker that's known as a northern flicker. And this is a yellow shafted, because if you see in the back there, his tail feathers are yellow and the shaft is yellow as well. If you go over the Rocky Mountains, there's still northern flickers, but they're called red shafted. But both are fruit eaters. This guy here, so this is a relatively common bird, but and I can tell it's a he, and I'll tell you why here in a second. This is what's known as a golden crowned kinglet. This is our smallest bird that overwinters in Western Pennsylvania. Now, they don't breed here. This is a Canadian bird of the boreal or northern forests of spruces and tamarack bogs. This bird is maybe 1.5 inches long, maybe. Weighs less than a penny, okay? This bird eats no seeds or suet. It won't come to your feeders. It spends all winter eating insects. So you're probably going, well, Chris, wait a minute. You said there's not very many insects during the winter and there's got all these seeds. Why aren't they eating them? That's a great question. These guys have specifically adapted to finding spider eggs and small overwintering beetles in crevices of bark on trees that they can survive all winter eating those. On top of that, these birds, which weigh, again, less than a penny, can survive temperatures down to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So they overwinter here all the way up into Maine. And I remember in the 90s, it was 1994, we had a minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the coldest temperature ever in Western Pennsylvania. It was January of 1994, and it dropped. I mean, it was so cold that I remember our pipes froze, and I remember going outside and hearing these guys at about 7:30 in the morning just flitting about like nothing was wrong. Because again, even though they're super tiny, their ability to regulate and keep that heat underneath them is amazing and just absolutely spectacular. NASA has studied a lot of their thermoregulation abilities as well. Here's a male, and that's why I say they're called golden crowns. Males, when they're angry or territorial, will flash this little crown that has this little orange intermixed with that yellow and black on there. Females just have the black and yellow, but they don't have the orange. But these guys are super tiny. Their voices, I can distinguish them. I don't even use binoculars. I use my ears more than binoculars now. They're very high pitched, and not everybody can hear that tone, but they are much more common than I think people realize. But they're not going to come to your feeders because they're eating insects. Here's another one. This is called a brown creeper, another boreal or northern forest species. They start to breed into the northern tiers of Pennsylvania, but we mostly get them hanging out down here in the wintertime. When I lead bird walks, a lot of new birders want me to find this bird for them because they're so camouflaged. And you can look kind of here, they blend in so well. You can see a little bit of their white on their breast, but when they're creeping up the tree, their feathers look exactly like bark. But just like the golden crown kinglets, they have especially adapted to just eat insects all winter, though with some exceptions will come to suet in really cold weather. And they too are a special bird. They're not rare, but they are hard to find. Okay, I want to make that distinction. I would call them relatively common, just very difficult to find just because they're so well camouflaged. Oh, why is Chris showing me a hole in the snow, right? Well, some of our what used to be a common winter bird, and I'll talk about this guy here in a second, so they've been around for a long time, and we used to get a lot more snow than we do today with our changing climate. And so one of the strategies, this is what a ruffed grouse does to survive very cold temperatures, is that it'll bury itself into deep snow and make almost like a little igloo deep down in it. In the early 90s, we still had this bird around Franklin Park and good bits of Western Pennsylvania, but they've become almost non-existent. And that's this guy here. This is a ruffed grouse. So this is, if you don't know, our state bird. Unfortunately, and ruffed grouse eat a lot of fruit in the wintertime. They can survive incredibly cold temperatures just fine because they're in the snow. They'll eat seeds and a whole host of other things. But since the year 2000, they've declined almost 80% in Pennsylvania, and they're rapidly declining. Some of it is habitat loss, but until recently, we didn't really know why. Until the last year or two, the Game Commission did studies that showed that they are being killed by West Nile virus. So if you heard about West Nile, it spreads from mosquitoes. People can get it. It does hurt some people, but it particularly is taking a severe toll on ruffed grouse to the point we think if things don't change here in possibly 100 years, they could be extinct in Pennsylvania. So they were once very, very common. I remember walking through the woods in Franklin Park, and you can literally walk 2 feet away from them and they fly away from you, sometimes burst out of the snow and just really scare you. But that rarely ever happens anymore. I got to go up to the Allegheny National Forest to even see one. So, but they have a pretty interesting strategy. There's a black-capped chickadee. So they go for a lot of seeds. Not all birds, though, that what I say are common winter birds. You're going to get are birds that are just going to be attracted to your feeders or eating insects, right? We do have a number of predatory birds. And I'll be honest with you, this does horrify a lot of people. But I say if you're feeding birds at bird feeders in your backyard, you're most likely going to be feeding predators, particularly the accipiter hawks like this guy here, right? This is what's known as a Cooper's hawk. So it is in the family of the accipiter or ambush hawks. Two other close relatives are the sharp-shinned hawk, which is more of a woodland accipiter, and the other one is called the northern goshawk, which you find in much larger woodland settings. These guys are incredibly smart, and I look at them going, I thank God every day that we're in the top of the food chain, because if we weren't and these guys were above us, it would be terrifying constantly, because they are scary hunters. They stalk their prey, they ambush them, and you never know they're there. And if I had more time, I could tell you about all of the amazing things that they do with their intelligence to figure out how to ambush prey. I mean, they are really, really smart. So when I think of what a predatory dinosaur must have been like back in the day, and I'm looking at those eyes, you can just imagine what some of those guys must have looked like back then. But Cooper's hawks are by far our most common winter hawk that's going to eat other birds. We do get red tails, which are very common, and increasingly more common red-shouldered hawks, but those guys tend to focus more on rodents. Here's what I wanted to show you when we talk about the thermal regulation of birds, right? So this is, I believe, a type of finch. I can't remember if it's a goldfinch or a house finch, but the temperature around this bird is around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? And what you're looking at here in this thermoregulation is you see the main body of the bird is losing. So the blue temperatures are very cool temperatures, which means they're not losing a lot of body heat. But as you get closer to the bird, right, most of that blood is coming from its core going to its brain. And it's the same thing with us. That's why we wear hats in the wintertime, to keep that heat from dissipating, right? Most of a bird's heat loss is coming through its bill, because that's where it's breathing. It's not as well insulated. It's also in the hotter months how it's able to get heat out of its body and stay cold, because they don't sweat. So what they do at nighttime to mitigate this when it's really cold and they're sleeping is, you may see ducks do this as well, often when they're sleeping, is they bury their bill and their face into their wings. Will tuck it underneath there and fluff themselves up and tuck that in there. So that way, during those long, cold winter nights, and most of these birds are not nesting in a cavity or a hole. Chickadees and other birds do, but most birds do not. They'll just be sitting on a branch out in the open, and it can be very windy. But once they tuck their face and bill in there and they'll grasp onto there, they're not losing very much body heat. So they can stay very comfortable throughout some temperatures that we would all be shaking our teeth on. Some people, like my wife, she's always cold when it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So we all have a different way of dealing with the cold there, right? I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is just if you really want to get into some of the engineering things of how this bird, and I do this because some people have super interest in this. I just want to say is that they've got some really neat things. They can constrict some of their vessels and shunt that colder blood away and just keep it from making the rest of their body colder. And they do this through their feet and stuff like that. So they bring the blood through the center part of their feet, so they're not losing a lot of heat. So, but if you want to learn more, you can get into this, but I don't want to bore you guys with this. They also do things that make them super cute, right? They like to cuddle and lean up against each other, because just like if you have a significant other or friend or whoever, right? When you're cold, it's always nice to hang, underneath a warm blanket with them, and our body heat keeps us warm. Birds do this as well. So that's one of those things that the golden crowned kinglet, which is so small, or chickadees, or this is a European bird here. It's one of the various species of what they're called tits over there, which just means small bird. These guys will push against each other and keep themselves relatively warm that way. So they'll do some huddling in some of the coldest temperatures as well. So if you want to get, and we'll go through all the different species here in a minute, but if you do want to attract birds to see them in the wintertime, there are some tips, right? And I always say you get what you pay for, in feeding birds and attracting birds is no different, right? You can buy cheap bird seed at other places, other stores that is mostly filled with millet. And millet is basically fill. Most birds do not want to eat that. It's just filler because the other parts, like the sunflower seeds and other types of foods, Niger, are more expensive. And so they can charge less prices, but birds are not going to eat those, right? So you want to go for higher end bird seed. And here, this is a shameless plug, but we sell what's called Beechwood Blend. You could buy it at Giant Eagle, or you could buy it at our Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve store. That gets a large number of birds because it doesn't really have millet. It's mostly sunflower and other types of food sources that all sorts of types of birds like. So you want to cover to protect the seed, because the seed can spoil, especially if you get warmer temperatures, and cause disease like salmonella that it won't get you, but it'll kill birds, right? So just keep it covered, keep some of the moisture off it. You want to have a wide cover over the feeding ports, because it gives them a little bit of feeling of safety. Perches and dispensing trays, so they're not buried during snowfalls or storms. And this last one's important. Fly-through platform feeders are especially good designs for winter bird feeding. I mean, right now with these evening grosbeaks, you'll see 20 of them on these platform feeders, which is really cool to see. It's very easy to refuel them and put them back up. Here's a real simple one, right? You're just seeing it's covered, keep some of that snow and moisture off there. Bird can fly in and perch, and then pull the seed up off of there as well. This is a little more advanced. It's a platform feeder, but it still has a cover, right? You can see there's a flicker there with a, looks like some goldfinches and a white crowned sparrow and a couple other different species there. This is a finch feeder for goldfinches and pine siskins, and hopefully, fingers crossed, common redpolls. It has small holes for the Niger seed in there, which is not native, but they do like it. And you'll get a lot of them, and it's very easy to refill. You just take it off, the cap pulls on the top, and you just pour the seed in there, and keeps it relatively sanitized as well. Okay. So placement. So a lot of people, again, you want to put this in an area that makes these birds in the winter feel comfortable coming in, and not like there's going to be a predator that can easily swoop in, or if it's a cat, come in there and take them, right? So you want to get them in sheltered areas out of the most severe winds. If you have hedges or small trees, or even bigger trees, or a brush pile, put it near them. It doesn't have to even be on one of them, but that gives them a protected area that they can land, and then they can, of course, observe and then fly in, make sure that there's no predators around. This last one's really important because maybe you've experienced this. Lots of millions upon millions of birds every year die from window collisions, and it's a bigger problem than people realize. But to minimize this, right, place feeders no more than 5 feet away from a wall or window. And it seems counterintuitive, but if you have a window cling, if you put it right up on the window, the bird is not going to get enough momentum to actually hit the window. If it's 5 feet away from the feeder, sometimes, and I've seen this happen when you get a hawk come in there, they'll pick up enough momentum and hit it and die instantly, right? So we want to try to avoid that as well. Here's a prime example. This is not a native species, and we're really big into pushing natives that were found here in Western PA prior to European settlement. But this type of cover will give a lot of birds, ground birds, the ability to kind of hop in there and feel safe before they fly up to the feeder, right? Because this kind of thing makes it hard for a bird like a Cooper's hawk to come in and take them, right? So this is a very important component of that. This is a little bit more manicured. Doesn't have a lot of native species, but you can kind of see the concept that I'm talking about here. Different heights, different bushes, things that give these birds the ability to come in there. And then, of course, if there's insects and other things, you'll get them taking a look at some of the various other trees and shrubs. Or you can see in the wintertime, right? So there's all that snow, but you've got now the structure that birds will be going hopping on around the bottom and on the edge and various things like that, looking for food and other sources there. So having habitat is just as important as having food, because these guys need to feel safe and have a place to roost and other things at nighttime as well. Okay. If there's one tree other than oak, if you want to plant, and it is our state tree and it's going through some challenges as well, plant an evergreen, but specifically eastern hemlock. It grows very well here in Western PA, or a white pine. Both are easy to grow, but produce tons of insects for birds in the summertime. Some birds need that to breed in the summer, but in winter, it has pine cones the birds will eat. It has insects. It has seeds. They'll roost inside there. So any pine, but particularly the hemlocks and the white pines are very good, particularly around here. Larger capacity, right, for birders' convenience. Sometimes if you have larger capacity, you don't have to fill them all that often. But open platform feeders are great. They just need to be refilled because you don't want mildew and spoilage, because some birds are often poisoned by this, and people that sometimes aren't as diligent. And also we do 1/3 vinegar, white vinegar, distilled white vinegar in hot water, and use it and that'll kill any type of bacteria or fungus that could potentially hurt them. So that's why having these ones to keep some of the moisture off is better. These are evening grosbeaks. These are not common, but this is what I put this in here specifically because, one, it shows a large platform feeder, but this is one of these eruptive species I was talking about. It is related to cardinals and rose-breasted grosbeaks that we have in the summertime. Rose-breasted are now down in South America, but these guys are from up in Canada, and they are little piggies. I tell you what, they will clean out your feeder in a second, and they roam absolutely widely, but they are really fun to watch, really neat birds. And so I wanted to show you, they're not common. But this year you have a better chance than we've had in several decades to actually get these guys here in Western Pennsylvania. Okay, so you don't always just get birds that come to your feeders, right? Yes, you'll get what I affectionately call trash pandas, because as raccoons are closely related to pandas, both red and the ones that you're probably familiar with in China. They are very smart too, and have thumbs just like we do, so they can open up lots of things, but they love birdseed. Okay, so do deer, so do possums, right? Sometimes where I live up here in Butler, so do bears. So be prepared. And then I'm not even talking about squirrels, right, which are going to try to defeat every single thing that you're going to do to keep them out. But I do have a secret weapon here, and it doesn't hurt them, and we sell it, and you can make it yourself, but it doesn't hurt birds. So some of you may like really, really hot, spicy stuff, right? Any hot, spicy people in here like hot, spicy food? Well, it's hot and spicy because peppers have a chemical called capsaicin, which mimics in our mammals' bodies the feeling that our mouth or hands or whatever is on fire. It mimics that same pathway. Birds don't have that. So what we do, and we sell, it's already pre-soaked, or you can make it yourself. As long as there's no salt in there, if you soak hot pepper flakes and put it on the seed, squirrels, chipmunks, mice, raccoons, deer, bears won't eat it, because they'll be having a 5 or 10 o'clock alarm fire, like if you remember from the cartoons back in the day, and they will stay away. Birds can't sense that. So all mammals can sense capsaicin, bird can't. So that's one way to get around there. But if you don't want to do that, you will see every single species of mammal want to come and enjoy your food. And hey, sometimes that's okay, right? Some people like that. So I'm not going to go too long here. Just keep it clean, right? Replace it if it gets wet, so you can spread disease. Okay. Plant natives. This is that Joe Pye weed. It's beautiful. It grows incredibly easy. People always go, well, isn't that a weed? No, a weed is only, a rose can be a weed if you don't want it, right? Any plant can be a weed if it's not where you want it. These guys are native plants. They're beautiful plants, as you can see here in the height of their blooming in August. They will attract monarch butterflies and at least 30 different species of butterflies at the very least. And then, like I said, they will produce seeds that the birds will absolutely devour. So we sell some of these at Beechwood at our Native Plant Center, but you can go around and collect them and plant them or order them online. But these are some of the best plants. And this is, again, Joe Pye weed to plant for birds, okay? So some of the ones I recommend, really going from top to bottom, black oil sunflower seed is the least expensive and most sought after by birds, right? Hulled peanuts and peanut hearts, you'll get the blue jays and the crows and stuff like that. Nigers for the finches. Suet mixes with seeds or fruit will attract some of the various woodpeckers. Peanut butter is great for a lot of them. White millet seed, some birds will eat it, but it's mostly a filler. And of course, again, out of all these, they'll go first for the native plants. And sunflowers are native, right? So they will go for all those first. I'm not going to go through this real quick. The only thing I want to say in here is if you really want to attract all birds in the winter, have a heated bird bath, because you will get birds that will not come to your feeders, but they need water and they need to bathe. So you can get ones that use either solar or just a small voltage that keeps it ice free here. All right, so let's go through some of these common winter species. So I kind of went over some of the basics there, but most of these birds, and I'll tell you about them, are either species that are resident, which means they're here year round, or they are winter migrants. So birds that breed north of us up in Canada and come down here specifically to stick around all winter. And these are all birds that I would consider as common that are easy to find here in Western Pennsylvania. So this is a female cardinal here, as you can see. They're different coloration between males and females or in size. Like birds of prey, bald eagles, females are larger than males. But we call this in biology sexual dimorphism, which just means the genders have something that distinguishes them. So in birds, it's often color or size that does that. But this is a female cardinal. And ladies, you got all the power in the bird world and the human world, let's be honest too. But in the bird world especially, yes, it's the females that drive this, okay? This is a tufted titmouse, right? It has a crest. It's only one of 3 birds that we have here in Western PA, at least in the winter, that have crests that you can distinguish. The first is a cardinal. Tufted titmice, both the males and females look exactly alike. They're little small gray birds. If you're learning bird calls and songs, they will frustrate you really, really bad because they do I've calculated over 30 different individual calls that these guys do. They sound like mice because they do a lot of little squeaks, but very, very common. This is a white-breasted nuthatch, which their backs in their heads are this steel blue gray color, and their breast is been described as white. You often see them creeping head first down on trees. They come to feeders that have sunflower seeds almost nonstop, and you can see their sharp pointed bill there. They'll grab sunflower seeds and often will cache them in bark crevices or like our side of our barn at Beechwood. And every year we have sunflowers that start to sprout outside some of the little shingles there because these guys had cached them in there, but also very common. This is a song sparrow, our most common sparrow, very widely distributed. It's a resident. See the little stick pin, as I call it. And he's turning his head, but they look like they have a little Fu Manchu mustache that kind of comes off their beak there on the side. And there's a little gap in the middle with little white streaking. These guys are interesting because they're called song sparrows because, again, they sing. But unlike most birds, the song that they sing is programmed in their DNA. These guys, they're not. They have a template, but the males have to hear adult males. So birds that were born this year have to hear adult males sing. And all fall and winter, they practice it. And you can hear them in this time of year and into winter, them practicing their song. It definitely sounds off a bit, but females judge their fitness on that song. And they are just across North America, as you can see here. They, interesting enough, have dialects. So just like some of us, Kate and she says y'all. I've lived in Western PA my whole life. I don't say yins, but some people do, right? We have different dialects in our languages. These guys do as well. Because of that, they have to listen and hear, and different changes that happen in their local populations are passed along in different generations. So it's pretty cool to see that. This is our most common woodpecker. In the winter, this is a downy woodpecker. Little sort of black and white with spots. Males have the little red in the back of the head. The females do not. But they're smaller than the hairy woodpecker, which you'll see next. If you look at their bill, the feathers come about midway through there, and their bill is much smaller. This is the poorly described false advertising bird, as they call it. This is called a red-bellied woodpecker. See the red belly on it? It's about as faint can be, right? We already had a red-headed woodpecker. but they are a southern woodpecker species that has moved north in the last 40 years. Back in the 60s, these birds were not found in Western Pennsylvania. This is a southern bird species that, because of climate change, is now very common in Western PA. Males have the full red mohawk. Females have a little bald spot on the top of their head. This guy, if you know who Woody Woodpecker is, this is who Woody Woodpecker was based on. This is a crow-sized woodpecker that we have here. It's a resident. It's called a pileated or pileated woodpecker. Both males and females have a little mustache coming off. Males, it's red. Females, it's black. You can see coming off the bill there. These guys, if you have wood siding, hope to God you don't get carpenter ants, because they can put a hole in the side of your house almost a foot around and a foot deep in about 3 to 4 minutes if they really want to. They're amazing. It's cool. I'm a Pitt grad and I do some, reading on birds and whatnot, but these guys, here's an interesting fact. They put so much pressure on their brain to open up these whole cavities that they cause brain damage. And they get, if you follow football and sports, right, the big thing in football especially is what's called CTE, where their human's brain is damaged and it causes dementia and other things as they get older. Well, these guys have evolved a way to repair that. And so Pitt right now in their concussion and CTE departments are studying how woodpeckers and the pileates especially are able to regrow these brain cells so they do not get CTE, which is pretty amazing. Plus their tongue actually wraps around, doesn't touch their brain, but it wraps all the way in the back side of the cavity, which adds sort of like some extra padding as well. This is not a resident. This is our most common winter migrant that sticks around. Sometimes colloquially is known as a snowbird, but this is a dark-eyed junco. And if you have old field guides like the Peterson, they were called slate-colored juncos, but they kind of grouped them all into one larger family called the dark-eyed juncos. They're called snowbirds because whenever they arrive, usually the snow just starts. And sure enough, this year they lived up to their name. So, but very, very common. They're a sparrow species, but you'll find them often around feeders on the ground. There's another northern migrant that overwinters here. This is called a white-throated sparrow. You can see with the white throat, the little what's called yellow lores coming out from the beak above their eyes, and then the black stripes and crown there. You can see here's another side view of these guys. These guys mostly hang around up in either northern New York to New England or up into most of Canada around bog areas, and they are in rapid decline. They're still common, but and we're not sure why, but they are rapidly declining. Here's close relative. This is called a white-crowned sparrow. Doesn't have the white throat. I'll go back. There's the white-throated sparrow. See how it's got the yellow? The white crown doesn't have that. Doesn't have the white throat. We get them in the winter here in small numbers. This is mostly a western bird, but does overwinter in small numbers here in Western PA. I do see them every winter, just not in any really large numbers, but a really striking, cool-looking bird. This is the American tree sparrow. They breed up around the Arctic tundra and only start to come in the Western PA around this time of year, mid to late November, and start leaving in late February. So they're not here for very long. But a larger sparrow has a rufous cap and sort of this grayish face. And one of the most distinguishing things that you see in the wintertime, and that you can pick these guys out right away, is they have what we call the little stick pin. So you see how white the belly is there? There's not, like the song sparrow, all the little streaks on him. He's just got this little black mark on his chest. You've got the rufous cap. That's one of the easiest sparrows to identify. And we get them, they're pretty common, but they have to be in areas that have larger brushy areas, but you can get them at your feeders. This guy's really cool. This is a fox sparrow. And this color does not even do them justice. When you see them in sunlight, I mean, they're just, that foxy red brown just glows. I mean, it is a gorgeous looking bird. Find it on the ground, often in really thick brush. But another one that overwinters here from the tundra. There's our friend, the golden crowned kinglet. He's mad about something. He's got his crown up, right? Eating insects. This is one that we get. This is one of those eruptive species. This is known as a red-breasted nuthatch. Much smaller than the white-breasted nuthatch. It's not resident, but it comes irregularly when the pine cone crops in Canada aren't so great. We've had some sticking around here this winter, so you can see them if you're out and about or if you feed birds. Here's another one. It's relatively common, but you got to go to specific areas like up near Moraine. This is called a ruffed leg hawk. It's a hawk that lives in the tundra and near the Arctic Circle in the summertime, warmer months, but then moves down here. They love strip mined areas. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but anywhere where I find an old strip mine that still has a lot of, there's no trees that have grown back, I tend to find these guys. But they're called rough leg because the feathers go all the way down to their feet, which is very different from a lot of the other hawks we have. And that's an adaptation for cold. So they're not losing that heat out of their feet. Yes, they are kissing. Okay, no, actually they're doing what's called billing here. These are two cedar waxwings giving each other fruit. Just really cool birds. I just saw a flock the other day here in Butler, probably 200 of them. So if you have crabapple trees, or if you have dogwood trees, or if you have anything that produces a lot of fruit, you'll tend to see these guys around. And it's they do get drunk on fermenting fruit too. I've seen them drunk out of their minds. It's actually pretty amusing to watch. This is that white-winged crossbill that, like I said, my fingers are crossed. The hope that they come through. This is one of those eruptive species. And if you can kind of see there, his bill is crossed. That's not a deformity. They're designed to hang. They will hang upside down, stick their crossed bill underneath those pine cone scales there, then like a parrot, take their tongue out and grab the seeds in there and eat them. And here you go. You can kind of see there how it's crossed. He doesn't have to hang upside down on that one, but their bill is crossed there. So here he is. So he's hanging upside down on some spruce. This is when they came. The last big influx of them in Western PA was 2012. And this is from down at Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve in Fox Chapel, where I got, this wasn't my picture. Someone got one hanging upside down on these pine cones, just pulling the seeds out. So really cool bird. Lastly, here to finish, and hopefully if you have any questions, you're thinking of them, excuse me. If you really want to get into it at wintertime, and I know with COVID, right, we're not able to go out and about as much, or you would just want to get into the science side, there is science that you could do at your house, in your backyard, if you have a feeder, and it doesn't matter where you are, and it's called Project Feeder Watch. This is through Cornell University. This is what got me into birds in the late 80s, because my mom had a bird feeder and we did this. And essentially it's super easy. You're just counting the birds that you see coming to your feeder either once a day, or there's a certain protocol, and then you just report it through the computer. And this helps scientists all winter to be able to look at this data and see, well, okay, what's going on in bird populations in real time? Are we seeing these birds increasing this year, decreasing? So it helps us get a real-time view on their populations, and helps us to understand what birds of conservation, what conservation species that we need to really be focused on, because they're declining. And I always say, right, if you need something to do this winter and you're not going anywhere, this is a perfect one to do, because every day I would get something different in my feeder. So it's a really easy one to do. The other one, if you're in a count circle and you guys are, I know Northland is probably in there, but if you live around Pittsburgh, or if you want to get even more ambitious to come up to Butler County, we lead the Christmas bird count. So it's not on Christmas Day. It's about 3 weeks on the sort of opposite side, 2 weeks before Christmas and 1 week afterwards. And this was invented by this gentleman here, Frank Chapman, in 1900. Because back then people used to do what was called side hunts. So they would go out on Christmas Day and shoot anything that flew, swam, walked, crawled. They would take all of the animals that they killed, usually birds, weigh them, see who killed the most amount of species. Then whoever killed the most would get a prize. They'd take all the birds they killed and just toss them in the garbage. So he knew, right, that this was not a good thing for conservation, that these birds were declining. So instead of killing them, he decided to come up with counting them as a competition. Well, this is going to be the 120th time that we've counted birds since 1900. And we have a really great database that shows what's going on with these species. And I lead one of them. So, and mine is January 2nd. So if you have any interest, you can reach out to me at Chris Kubiak at the Audubon Society of Western PA, and I can give you more information. Okay. this is a little, I should have updated it, but yeah, we had 2 years ago, 71,000 people, over 2,300 count circles, counted over 64 million birds and 661 species. So, and you don't have to be an expert birder. If you have a feeder and you're in a count circle, we can, just count those birds, but it's just a fun way to get out. We're going to be socially distant, of course. We'll pair you with an experienced birder. So, and it's doing science. Great for kids. We do stuff with kids as well, doing this, getting them out there and doing actual science that scientists are looking at. So here's the Pittsburgh one. This is just what we call our count circle. So, but if, like I said, any more information, somewhere you're in there, Northland, because I see it's around McCandless there. Yeah, forget all that stuff. So I'm just going through there. And then lastly here, right? I just call this is the basics, the S's of birding. Sight, sound, sight, season, or how I know it's Aunt Nancy, right? And so basically you're using certain things, and people think this is magical when I do it. And really, if I can do this, anybody can do this. So I teach bird watching techniques, how to bird by sight, but then once you get that down, using your ears. And I'll be honest with you, in most of the year, I use my ears 90% of the time because there's just so many other cues, it's hard to see them. So your ears are often some of your best, in using that sense to find birds. So with that said, I can be very wordy, I know. If you guys have a question, if you want to ask, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, or if there's any other chat questions or anything else, please let me know.
I'll jump in. We did have some in the chat.
Okay.
We had a lot about different squirrels and rats eating from the bird feeder, which hopefully we addressed with talking about the chili flakes.
Yep. Yeah, there's a brand, if you don't want to go through all the rigmarole, there's a brand of seed called Hot Meats, which is because the meats are the part of the seed that the bird's eating, and they soak it in capsaicin. And I will tell you, it is the funniest thing in the world to see a squirrel that has never eaten this stuff before. And they come up to the feeder and they go up and start eating one. And you could literally see, I'm not joking, it's like you could see the smoke almost starting to come out of their ears. They drop it and run and they won't come back. And it's not hurting them, right? It's just mimicking, a burning sensation, but birds can't sense it. And that, to me, rats won't eat it, mice won't eat it, nothing will eat it. So now it does wear off over time, but usually the birds are eating it and the mammals aren't coming in to steal it. So, but you can easily replicate that at your house as well.
We also had a question from someone asking, what can we do to help the ruffled grouse better survive? What is the PA Game Commission and Audubon Society doing to increase their survival in fighting the West Nile?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, the fighting West Nile itself is very difficult because you're talking about landscape scale mitigation efforts, because first off, the mosquito that spreads it is not native. It was brought over from, I believe, Africa or the Middle East in ships. And so like anything, if you don't enjoy having mosquitoes at your house, you could at least in the summer months dump out standing water, because that's what mosquitoes are using for their larvae. The Game Commission, of course, is actually, they've been studying this now, it's going to be spraying some areas in these larger forests, specifically targeting these mosquitoes. And interestingly enough, they're working on basically genetically modified male mosquitoes who don't bite, but when they mate with the females become sterile. So that's one way of getting them down. The other thing, quite honestly, is finding and saving better habitat. If you go to Moraine State Park or other areas, people get upset when they see the state cut down swaths of the forest. And they get mad. They're going, why are you destroying this? Well, ruffed grouse really like and need younger forests. And so they're managing it specifically for their habitat types. So if you see that, right, don't get mad at the state. It's encourage it and just learn about them because, and I will tell you the other thing too, quite honestly, that maybe they're, if we don't get West Nile under hand, they are severely threatened by climate change because they have really distinctive habitat as well as climate associations. And as the climate warms, that's causing another issue. And of course, it's allowing these mosquitoes to survive anyway. So if you have any interest in that, go to the Pennsylvania State Game Commission and go to the ruffed grouse section. And they have a lot of different things that you can do and some more information in depth on that as well. So.
We had another one, only other one in the chat. They said, I put out bird houses in the summer. Wrens use them and their nest materials in there. Is it best to clean that out? Not sure if birds in the winter will use them.
Yeah, believe it or not, birds in the winter will roost in their chickadees and nuthatches. Well, they're not particular, so they're not going to throw out that nesting material from the wrens. So, and wrens themselves, if they come back the next year and want to nest in there, they'll remove that themselves and put new material in there. So you really don't have to do a whole lot. Now, bluebirds is a different story. Bluebirds are a little more particular, and you have to, of course, clean that out and manage them as well. But yeah, but wrens and stuff, I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay, that was all we got in the chat.
We had one question.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah,
is there a way of distracting the downy woodpecker from the wood siding on our house?
Oh, that's a tough one. I get that one a lot too, right? So there could be one of two issues going on depending on when they do this. One thing is, and I hope this is the case, is they like to do what's called drumming. So instead of singing, they attract mates and tell other males where their territory is by hitting the side of your house or a tree and making a certain sound. Okay, so that's one thing. But really, when they're doing that to your house office, especially, do you have wooden siding? They're finding insects in that wood just like they would out in the forest. So they're looking for food sources in there. So my suggestion to people always is that obviously if you can't get different siding, right? If you buy a faux owl, a fake owl of some type, you can put that around. But here's the thing, birds are not, two of them? Yeah, but here's the thing, you have to move them on a daily basis. Because, yeah, the birds will see that and they go, oh, he's not moving, he's not a threat. And so they don't care anymore. So unless they're being moved around, they get wise very fast. And so seeing a owl won't really do much for them. So, but yeah, they're probably finding food in your wooden siding. And so, and once they do, they're like, oh, I'm going to come back here because there was a good snack that I had here the other day. So. Sure.
I have a question.
Sure.
I love my bird feeder that it holds the Niger seed.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the shape of a lighthouse, and I really like it, but it's become rusted.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that I can do something to remove the rust? I'm thinking of the safety of the bird.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go and use a chemical to remove the rust and then repaint it and find out it's just all poisonous to the bird.
Yeah, probably what you need to do with that. I mean, WD-40 is not going to necessarily harm the birds, but they'll smell that because that's oil-based and that will dissuade them from coming. You can use like linseed oil and stuff like that that's a little more natural, or even like canola, and lightly with steel wool, rub it out, right?
Oh,
but
good.
I'll be honest with you. I mean, I know if you want to keep that, that's great. It's just going to take a lot of work because those things oxidize and rust very quickly there. And I would suggest once you do that, any kind of latex, outdoor latex paint is safe for birds and animals and people. So once you get it cleaned up, having a latex paint on it, and again, I don't know if that's the aesthetics that you're looking for, but that will keep it relatively clean and rust-free and not hurt the birds as well. So
thank you. And I noticed from some of the photos, there was like a sort of baffle, if you will. I've looked at them to prevent the squirrels, and I am gonna try that hot pepper
Mhm.
thing because they really decimate the seed at the
Yep.
bird feeders.
Yep.
And I looked at baffles, and some of the baffles are like 30 to 50 bucks, and it's just
Mhm.
ridiculous. Is there something I can do that's a do-it-yourself
And I
baffle
hate,
to
yeah,
protect the seed from the snow and the rain, like you recommend?
yeah, the baffles, I'll be honest with you, and you probably noticed too, you can even get those higher end ones, and the squirrels are smart. They will figure out, they'll contort themselves and jump and figure out all different ways to get around it. There's cool ones that look like slinkies. You can actually look this up, where when the squirrel jumps on it, the slinky pulls down, and then when they let go of it, the slinky goes back up. That one is actually fun to watch them do it, number one, and try to figure out how to get around it. But two, it's really easy to do. But I will tell you, no matter what you do, squirrels are going to figure out how to get around it eventually. I mean, they are really smarter than people give them credit for. So that's why I always default to the hot meats or doing some kind of hot pepper. You can buy them in bulk and just add them. I'd spray them with a little bit of water before they stick on there, and it's amazing the difference that it makes, and will save a big headache to it. But look up the Slinky Squirrel Baffle, because that one, they'll get around it eventually, but it is somewhat more effective than some of the other ones. Most of those other baffles are just to keep rain and snow and other conditions off the seed.
Yeah, that's what I want. I want something to keep the rain and snow off the seed.
Yep.
So I mean, some of the baffles I looked at, I've seen plastic ones that are like 12, 15 bucks.
Yep.
That be about average then.
Yeah, yeah. That's then if you don't want to go higher end, yeah, the plastic baffles they work just as well.
Okay, and there's no do-it-yourself thing that I can do to help.
You probably could find some designs. I've never really looked at it, but I suspect, like I said, you're going to get something that's kind of concave. So if there's any kind of like larger plastic bowl or something like that, that might work. But it might just be as easy as just dropping $12 just to get one to cover it as well.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
In the chat, someone asked about owls. Said we
Owls, okay.
hear them hooing now in the woods across from our house, but not at other times during the year.
Yep.
What owls are out in fall, winter?
Well, I'll tell you the species here in a second, but the reason why you're hearing it now is love is in the air, as I say, and they breed in the wintertime, at least in primary. In fact, the great horned owl is our earliest breeding bird. They start having their young in January, of all places. Now, so they're the biggest, they're the apex predators. They sit on the top of the food chain. The great horned owl that does the hoot hoot call, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. The one that's lower down on the food chain, the eastern screech owl, that sounds like a whinnying of a horse or a kind of like a mixture with that and a ghost. Those guys, great horned owls, will eat them. They don't breed until the spring, but the reason why they're calling now is there's a much higher competition for food sources. So they're calling basically to tell other males and females, to stay away from their territory, and they'll defend it pretty aggressively because, again, food is really what everything revolves around. The other species that you can find around here, which is fairly common, but you got to get in larger wood blocks, is called a barred owl, B-A-R-R-E-D. It's barred because its feathers look like they're bars. They have one of the funniest bird calls ever. It sounds like they're saying, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" They do a call that sounds like a dog barking. You can listen to it. It's a really cool. But those three are most common. In smaller numbers of different areas, there's the northern saw-whet owls that migrate through. A good friend of mine, Bob Mulvihill, was catching them and banding them down in Big Swickley Creek area, I think down near Swickley Heights Park. But I think with COVID, he's just doing it by himself. But you were allowed to go and actually see this. You can see the owls up close. And then other spots in Western PA, they're not as common, but you can find short-eared and long-eared owls as well, and some years also snowy owls.
That's a good segue into our next question.
Cool.
Can you recommend any classes or online resources for learning more bird calls, songs from home? I have a very distinctive, lovely bird call I'm hearing in the wee hours, 3 to 6 a.m., and I can't place it.
Well, one of my things I'll recommend, and this is a shameless plug, but I have to since I work for Audubon, I do teach classes that will, get you a little more advanced and things like that. But if you just want to start and learn from home, honestly, going to Cornell University's library, you can find every single call at Cornell University. You can go to Google and type Cornell University bird calls, and it's called McCulvey, or I'm probably not pronouncing it right because I haven't eaten dinner yet. McCulvey, something like that, where they've got every North American species, not just their song, but call notes. Okay. Now, I will tell you, learning bird calls is like learning a foreign language, because in what you hear, there is so much diversity, right, across individuals and through species that people will go, well, I have this call from Cornell, but it sounds like this, but it's not exactly that. And I go, yeah, because it's an individual, right? And I teach people, start with the common ones in your backyard, the blue jays, the cardinals, the robins, the Carolina wrens, those kind of things. Start with those common ones and use mnemonics. We all do this, right? Do you remember in school to remember the colors of the rainbow? You use Roy G. Biv to remember the different colors. I use mnemonics with birds. So for example, in Eastern Towhee, when they sing, they go, drink your tea, drink your tea. So I remember that's an Eastern Towhee. Or if a black-capped chickadee goes, hey, sweetie, hey, sweetie. So in my mind's eye, using the mnemonic, it recalls what that species is, right? So focus on those guys. Use Cornell's library. It's free. There's other apps that you can download on your phone called Merlin, like the bird Merlin, and it too. But again, I find that people get frustrated because, especially when they're starting, is they're going, well, I hear this sounds like this, but it's not exactly the same. There's variation, just like there is in individual human beings and how we talk, right? So just keep that in mind. And like anything else, just practice. It just takes practice. And if you want to keep your brain challenged in learning new things, birdsong is a great one. So my last thing on that is my master birder class. If you really want to get in depth, I lead it just like master gardeners, but it's for birding, where they've got to learn not just the birds around here by sight, but also by their calls. And they realized how difficult tufted titmice are because they do so many. So they made a shirt, because I have this saying, I go, when in doubt, it's probably a tufted titmouse if you can't identify. So they made me a t-shirt with a tufted titmouse that says that I wear sometimes. But just start with the basics and focus on those birds that you see in the wintertime at your backyard and listen to what they're saying and doing.
Any tips to attract bluebirds to my birdhouse for the spring?
Yes, I did think I saw that one come up. Well, bluebirds there's good news with those guys. So 50, 60 years ago, they were on the verge of extinction. So putting up bluebird houses can attract them. That doesn't mean you're going to get them, though, because they are a bird that likes really specific conditions. They like wide open areas with edges of woods and fields. So if you don't have that, that's going to make it hard. The second thing, and this is key, I don't know if you have bluebird houses already, but there's types of bluebird houses that prevent two invasive species from coming in there and taking over the nest and potentially killing the bluebirds, right? So there's types of bluebird boxes that stop the European starling and, even worse, the English house sparrow from coming into the box, killing the bluebirds, and then using the nest. And that was why they were declining, right? I guarantee you every one of you here has either seen or heard an English house sparrow in the city or a European starling, even if you didn't realize it. They're that ubiquitous. But without getting a certain bluebird box, if you have the ability, you have the right habitat, you're not going to get bluebirds because they're wimpy birds. They didn't evolve with these guys, and these other European birds are very aggressive. And every year with bluebird boxes that I'm around or people are asking about them, they will find dead bluebirds with their eyes pecked out in pretty horrible ways by the English house sparrows. So number one, consider where your habitat is, right? If you have open fields with a little bit of woods around, that's good habitat. Get a nesting box that you look up that specifically will keep English house sparrows, and starlings out. And lastly, I forgot one thing I should have mentioned. If you do have them around, keep dried mealworms because they love dried mealworms in the wintertime.
Okay, it looks like that is everything we had in the chat. I wanted to make sure to give everyone a chance. If you did still have a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
And if you think of one later, follow-up question, you can always go to aswp.org. That's for Audubon Society Western PA. You'll see my email on there. You can just send me a question.
And I can also include Chris's email in my follow-up email that you'll all be getting either tonight or in the morning. So that way I'll include the website and Chris's email.
So the question I see here in chat, are 2 boxes an okay idea for bluebirds to let sparrows take one of the 2 boxes? Nope. Even if, let's just say one of the boxes is empty and the bluebirds take the other one, the English house sparrows will still either chase out or kill the bluebirds and defend both of the boxes, even if they're only using one of them. That's just how they are. And again, there's nothing in the evolutionary history of bluebirds because up until about 150 years ago, those birds weren't here in North America. So you got to have something to remove the English house sparrow. My neighbor, I have bluebird boxes and I have the ones that will prevent the English house sparrows, but they can't even, there's so many English house sparrows around where I live that will even chase off the bluebirds before they even get a chance to even start. So I've been trying to find ways to see if we can get the numbers of the English house sparrows down, but it's really hard because again, there's just a lot of them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. That was a
Thank
great
you.
program, and thank you everyone for attending and being so active. I love getting all the questions and seeing the participation. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. And like I said, love to do these in the future. So enjoy yourselves and keep watching the birds.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you, Kate.